I knew something was off the moment I saw the folding tables being dragged across my front lawn. It was a Saturday morning, and I was halfway through brewing my coffee when I looked out the window and spotted 3 HOA board members planting metal stakes into my grass. One of them was Judith Penley, the HOA president, 50-something, spiky haircut, and a mouth that never shut up unless she was plotting something. I stepped outside in my slippers, mug in hand. "What the hell are you doing on my lawn?" Judith turned around like she hadn't just hammered a stake into my flower bed. "Oh, Zachary. We're setting up for the spring VIP mixer. It's for HOA board members and our special guests. We needed a scenic spot, and your lawn has the best view of the lake." I blinked. "You didn't ask me." She waved a clipboard at me like it was a golden ticket. "It was in last month's meeting notes. You should have read the minutes." "I didn't agree to this." "Well, silence is consent, isn't it?" she said with a laugh, then turned back to the others. "Move the champagne table more to the left, closer to the hydrangeas." Within the hour, my lawn looked like a wedding reception. White tents, folding chairs, a guy in a tuxedo setting up speakers. I stood there, stunned, trying to process how my own front yard had become Coachella for HOA bigwigs. I wasn't just mad. I was insulted. I pay my dues. I mow my own damn lawn. And these people thought they could just set up shop like I was some kind of pushover? I called my buddy, Devin, who's a real estate attorney. I explained everything, and his response was simple. "Zach, that's trespassing. If it's your private property, they need permission, HOA or not." I hung up and walked back outside. Judith was standing near my porch now, sipping from a flute of champagne and laughing with a guy in a white suit who looked like he got lost on the way to a yacht. "Judith," I said calmly, "you've got 5 minutes to get off my property." She gave me a look like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum. "Zachary, sweetie, the event's already started. It would be extremely rude to interrupt." I looked her dead in the eye. "Then I guess I'll be rude." She rolled her eyes and turned away, waving at a woman in a sequined blazer. That's when I saw the sprinkler control panel next to the side door. The one I'd upgraded last summer with full zone override. I stepped inside, pressed the button, and turned every single sprinkler head on full blast. The shrieking started immediately. Dozens of heads whipped around as the sprinkler heads popped up one by one and unleashed a glorious, high-pressure revenge arc across the entire yard. Jets of cold water slammed into folding chairs, soaked tablecloths, and turned Judith's prized VIP mixer into a wet T-shirt contest for middle-aged board members. The woman in the sequin blazer let out a strangled gasp as her makeup ran down her cheeks. Someone dropped a tray of hors d'oeuvres. The man in the white suit slipped and fell backward into a decorative hedge, flailing like an upended turtle. The sound of clinking champagne glasses swiftly gave way to scrambling feet and panicked shrieks. Judith spun around, her hair already drooping as water streamed down her forehead. "What do you think you're doing?" I stepped outside again, slowly, deliberately, letting the doors swing shut behind me. "Exercising my property rights. You're welcome to leave at any time." She stormed toward me, heels squelching in the mud. "You're causing damage." "That's destruction of HOA property." I pointed at the soaked tables. "That's my lawn. And unless your bylaws secretly granted you eminent domain, you're all trespassing. Want to take it to court?" Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Behind her, a speaker sparked and blew out with a pop, emitting a thin trail of smoke. The guy who'd set it up cursed and began yanking cables out of the soggy power strip. Judith turned away and barked at her entourage. "Everyone, grab what you can and move it to the clubhouse. We'll relocate." "Too late for that," I said. "The clubhouse doesn't have a lake view, remember?" She ignored me, sloshing across the lawn to rally her soaking wet troops. Folding chairs were being dragged through the mud. Plastic champagne flutes floated like little boats toward the curb. I leaned against the porch railing, watching the chaos unfold. But I wasn't done. I'd already pulled the property line survey from the county's GIS system earlier that week, anticipating something shady. Judith had been slowly blurring boundaries for months, first with HOA signs edging into private yards, then by reorganizing the community garden so it conveniently expanded behind her house. No one had pushed back. Until now. And now I had evidence and witnesses. My neighbor, Mr. Halvorsen, a retired surveyor with a camcorder obsession, had caught the entire sprinkler spectacle from his second-story window. He leaned out from the balcony, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning, camera rolling. "Don't worry, Zach. Got the whole thing. Audio and all. Judith looked up at him, scowling. That's a violation of privacy. He called back. It's your voice on his lawn. You brought the party. I'm just filming the parade. By the time they finally cleared out muddy, humiliated, and dripping wet, I had over 40 minutes of footage, 2 confirmed boundary violations, and 3 neighbors offering to write statements. But I wasn't satisfied with just a soaked HOA president and a ruined brunch. I wanted accountability. I spent the next day compiling everything. Screenshots of emails, annotated maps, timestamps from the footage, and a notarized affidavit from Mr. Halvorsen. Then I drove straight to the city's planning and zoning department. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow as I spread out the documents. You're saying the HOA hosted an unauthorized event on private land? I nodded. Without notice. No permits. And electrical equipment was connected through extension cords running across a public sidewalk. He frowned. That's a fire code violation. And if they didn't have a permit, that's a zoning infraction. I figured as much. He took a deep breath and began scanning the documents into their system. You should expect a follow-up from the enforcement officer this week. We don't take this kind of thing lightly. I thanked him and left, but my next stop was even more satisfying. Back home, I called Devin again. This time, I laid out the entire paper trail, including the footage from Halvorsen and the city's intake form. He whistled. You've got them boxed in. Trespassing, electrical code violations, civil liability for property damage, and possibly insurance fraud if any claims are filed under HOA policies. I leaned back in my chair. You think it's enough to bring them down? He paused for a moment. If you want to hit them where it hurts, don't aim for a payout. Push for an audit. That lit the fuse. I filed a formal grievance with the County Office of Homeowner Association Oversight. Yes, that's a real thing here. Along with my complaint, I submitted a petition signed by 12 homeowners demanding a full audit of the HOA's financials and board practices. Judith had been running the books for over 6 years without an independent review. When the county replied 2 weeks later, it was with a letter confirming an official audit had been scheduled and that the HOA would be required to present all financial records from the past 5 years, including discretionary spending, board compensation, and vendor contracts. The fuse had officially reached the powder keg. Within days, Judith's tone changed. She went from demanding apologies to issuing nervous newsletters about upcoming transparency initiatives and new opportunities for community dialogue. She called an emergency meeting on neutral ground this time, not my lawn, and tried to spin the whole incident as a misunderstanding. But the residents weren't buying it anymore. At the meeting, Barry from Lot 22 stood up and said, "How many other things have you done without permission? If you'll throw a party on someone's yard without asking, what else are you hiding?" Judith shifted uncomfortably. The board always acts in the neighborhood's best interest. A woman near the back, holding a printout of the sprinkler footage, replied, "Then why does your nephew's landscaping company get paid double what anyone else charges?" The room went quiet. That's when I stood up, holding the county audit notice. This isn't about grass or champagne. It's about abuse of power. And it ends now. Judith's face went pale. She reached for the mic, but Barry stepped forward, blocking her. Let him speak. I laid out the timeline. The unauthorized party. The boundary violations. The misuse of HOA funds that had quietly funneled money into her relatives' pockets. The electrical risks. The lack of permits. The city violations. By the time I was done, no one was defending her. Not even the board members who'd helped set up the tents. 3 days later, the treasurer resigned. A week after that, the HOA's attorney sent out a letter stating that the board would be restructured, effective immediately, to comply with the county's audit directives. Judith? She vanished from the neighborhood Facebook group and put her house on the market within a month. And as for my lawn? It recovered. The grass grew back thicker than ever, fertilized by the tears of HOA tyranny. The audit wasn't just a formality, it was a wrecking ball. The county sent in 2 forensic accountants, both with backgrounds in municipal fraud investigations. They didn't just skim through Judith's spreadsheets. They dug deep, cross-checking vendor payments, contract start dates, and reimbursement claims. Within 3 weeks, they uncovered something far worse than overpaying her nephew's landscaping gig. There were falsified invoices tied to a security consultant who, according to tax records, didn't exist. Thousands of dollars had been approved for equipment upgrades that no one in the community had ever seen. The most damning piece, A wire transfer to a shell company traced to a P.O. box in another county, the same address listed under Judith's maiden name on a public business filing from 5 years ago. The investigators didn't hesitate. They handed everything over to the district attorney's office. I found out about the criminal inquiry when Detective Langan showed up at my doorstep one morning. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered guy with the kind of deliberate calm that made you think twice before lying to him. "You're Zachary Weller?" he asked, flashing his badge. I nodded, stepping onto the porch. "That's me. We've reviewed the footage and your documentation. I need to ask you some questions about the HOA board, specifically Judith Penley's role in approving vendor payments and organizing events." I led him inside and offered coffee, which he politely declined. He opened a legal pad and began walking through specific dates of meetings, names of contractors, how expenses were communicated to residents, and whether there had ever been a vote on the so-called upgrades. I answered everything, and when I showed him the spreadsheet I'd been keeping since the audit began, his eyebrows lifted slightly. "You ever work in compliance?" he asked. "Used to do procurement logistics for a hospital system. Learned to follow money trails." "That explains it," he said, jotting something down. A week later, the warrant came down like a thunderclap. Judith was arrested outside a boutique hair salon 2 towns over. They cuffed her in heels and a cashmere cardigan, right on the sidewalk. The local paper ran the story with a headline that might as well have been gift-wrapped: "HOA president accused of embezzlement, fraud, and abuse of power." The charges included wire fraud, falsifying financial records, and unlawful use of community funds felonies. The DA's statement mentioned a pattern of deceptive financial practices carried out under the guise of community improvement. The fallout wasn't quiet. The HOA board scrambled to distance themselves. 3 resignations dropped in under 48 hours. A 4th member, Marcy Dillard, tried to hold on by insisting she thought all the expenses were within legal parameters. That didn't sit well with the residents who had just learned their dues had funded a $3,600 espresso machine labeled as a security asset. At the emergency town hall meeting held in the elementary school gymnasium, the mood was somewhere between a court hearing and a mutiny. Devin came with me. He wasn't there as my lawyer, just moral support, but his presence carried weight. He leaned against the back wall while I stood in front of over 60 neighbors, many of whom had never spoken up at meetings before. "I'm not here to be in charge," I said, scanning the room. "But I think we've all learned what happens when no one's watching the people who are." A man in the 3rd row stood up. "Ralph, from the far end of the lake. What's stopping this from happening again?" "We trusted her." A voice from the back chimed in. "We don't even know what half the budget was spent on." I waited for the murmurs to die down before answering. "We build a committee, independent from the board. Quarterly reviews, public access to the books, and vendor bids have to be verified by a 3rd party. No more rubber stamps." Someone clapped, then 2 more. And soon the entire room was on its feet. By the end of the night, we had formed the oversight committee. I wasn't the chair. Mrs. Garcia, a retired IRS auditor, volunteered for that role, but I was part of it. We had 5 members total, each from a different part of the neighborhood. People who didn't have skin in the game beyond wanting things to be fair. But the deeper we looked, the uglier it got. Judith hadn't just embezzled. She'd rigged community votes by sending out fake ballots. The audit turned up 3 separate instances where vote counts didn't match resident responses. One of the votes had approved a property acquisition land that still technically belonged to a widow who had moved out of state but hadn't transferred the deed. Judith had been trying to flip it to the HOA and resell it as a community enhancement parcel. That's when it became clear this wasn't just corruption. It was calculated. The DA added 2 more charges, including attempted real estate fraud. A court date was set. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Judith's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal. The DA refused. "They want to make an example of her," Devin told me over lunch one afternoon. "She used her position to orchestrate a personal profit scheme under the guise of community service." Judges don't like that. The trial drew media attention. Courtroom sketches made the evening news. I was called as a witness on the 2nd day. I brought copies of every document I'd submitted, including the footage from the sprinkler incident which, ironically, became the catalyst for the entire investigation. The opposing counsel tried to paint me as vindictive. "Isn't it true you intentionally created a public spectacle to embarrass the defendant?" I looked straight ahead. I turned on my own sprinklers. On my own lawn. After she refused to leave, the jury didn't need convincing. Judith was found guilty on 8 counts. She was sentenced to 4 years in a minimum security facility and ordered to pay restitution to the HOA money that would take decades to recover. But no one in the neighborhood was waiting for that check. We'd already begun rebuilding. The new board, yes, an entirely new one, instituted open budgeting sessions. Every resident got access to the ledger. Vendors had to meet strict transparency standards. We even launched a neighborhood app where people could flag anything fishy for the committee to review. One Saturday, as I was reseeding the patch of lawn that had been trampled months earlier, Halvorsen wandered over from next door, holding a manila envelope. "Thought you'd want this," he said, handing it to me. Inside were printed stills from the original footage, Judith standing with a champagne flute, the sprinklers mid-spray, guests scattering like pigeons. "Figured you might want to frame one," he said, chuckling. I shook my head. "Nah, I think the lawn's enough." Because sometimes, justice isn't a courtroom verdict or a front-page headline. Sometimes, it's a quiet afternoon, a repaired fence, and the knowledge that no one will ever mistake your front yard for a banquet hall again. I hadn't been to a community barbecue in over 3 years, but there I was, paper plate in hand, standing under the shade of a sycamore tree while 2 neighborhood kids chased each other with water balloons. The vibe had changed. No one was whispering about budget rumors. No one was guarding their words like they were being watched. It felt lighter, easier. Like we were finally living in our own homes again, not just renting them from a tyrant wrapped in HOA policy. Still, not everyone was over it. "You think she'll appeal?" asked Dana, the nurse who lived up the street. She was watching her dog nose around the grill, sniffing for dropped burger bits. "She can try," I said. But the court found enough paper trail to bury a bank. Any appeal would just drag her through it all over again. Dana shook her head and muttered, "Never thought someone could turn a garden party into a felony." It was easy to laugh now, but there were still loose ends. The restitution order had turned up some strange financial activity, sealed accounts, a dormant trust fund tied to an HOA beautification grant, and a series of blank checks signed months in advance. The judge had ordered a continuation hearing to determine whether any other board members had known about the shell companies. But none of that was my concern anymore. I'd stepped down from the oversight committee. My job was done, or so I thought. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I got the call from Mrs. Garcia. She didn't waste time on small talk. "We found another ledger," she said. "Stuff that wasn't included in the audit." "Where?" "Behind a false panel in the old HOA storage shed. It was bolted shut, took Frank's crowbar to get it open." "What's in it?" "Receipts. Property surveys. A list of names." That last one made my stomach turn. Names. There's notations next to each. Dates. Some of them go back 6 years. I drove over within the hour. The ledger was thicker than a phone book and smelled like mildew. It was full of handwritten entries in tight block letters. One section was labeled Obstruction Index, and that's where it got ugly. It listed residents by address, followed by coded entries like delay permit, slow mail, or fine threat. We'd all assumed the HOA's occasional incompetence was just that, incompetence. But this was intentional. Residents who had questioned budgets or voted against Judith's proposals had been targeted. Their mail was rerouted. Landscaping fines were fabricated. In one case, a permit for a roof repair had been lost in processing 3 times before the homeowner gave up and moved out. I flipped through faster. Toward the back, a smaller column caught my eye. It had only 2 entries. Mine was the first. Weller monitor. Escalation risk. The other name was crossed out entirely, but not before I caught the word suit. "This is retaliation," I said, handing the book back to Mrs. Garcia. "Coordinated, documented, and possibly criminal." She nodded. "Already called the DA." The ledger changed everything. The district attorney's office opened a secondary case, this time centered on civil rights violations and mail tampering. A federal investigator joined, citing the possibility of postal fraud. The HOA's former secretary, a quiet man named Gerald who had resigned without a word, was subpoenaed. Under oath, he admitted he'd been told to flag certain addresses for special handling, including mine. That triggered a chain reaction. 3 more former board members were pulled in. One of them flipped immediately, providing emails Judith had sent through a private account. In them, she detailed how to discipline resistance and create procedural fog around any homeowner who became too vocal. The case turned federal after that. A grand jury convened. The charges now included conspiracy to interfere with housing rights, mail fraud, and tampering with public records. It went beyond Judith. The rot had spread deeper than anyone had guessed. Investigators discovered that over a dozen residents had been victims of these tactics. Delayed insurance approvals, canceled trash pickups, anonymous complaints filed with Child Protective Services, none of which went anywhere, but all of which cost time, money, and peace of mind. One elderly couple, the Lincolns, had complained about a drainage issue behind their yard. 3 weeks later, their mailbox was removed without notice by city workers who didn't exist. The Lincolns had to drive to the nearest post office for almost 2 months before it was replaced. The courtroom was packed the day the federal charges were read. Judith appeared via video from the correctional facility, now facing a fresh round of indictments. Her lawyer tried to argue that she had acted in the best interest of the community, but the judge wasn't having it. When the prosecution laid out the retaliatory tactics, people in the gallery gasped. No one had known it was that deep. At sentencing, the judge called the scheme a systematic abuse of administrative power designed to punish dissent and manipulate property values. Her sentence was extended by 6 more years. She was also barred from serving on any residential board or committee for life. The final chapter came quietly. The HOA was dissolved. The residents voted, overwhelmingly, to replace it with a neighborhood advisory council, a voluntary group with no enforcement power, only the ability to recommend local improvements and manage shared spaces. No dues, no fines, just neighbors helping neighbors. The former clubhouse was converted into a community library, stocked with donated books and a small study room. The storage shed, once used to hide fraudulent ledgers, was torn down during a volunteer cleanup day. Someone painted a mural on the back wall of the library where it had stood. It showed a wide green lawn, a burst of water spraying from sprinklers, and a crowd of people laughing beneath the spray. I didn't paint it. Halvorson's granddaughter did. One afternoon, she asked me if it had really happened that way with everyone running and Judith standing there getting soaked. I told her yes, and that it had been the best moment of the year. But that wasn't really true. The best moment was walking out my front door one morning and seeing a welcome note tucked under my doormat, not a warning, not a fine, just a scribbled note from a neighbor. Thanks for standing up when it counted. Because in the end, it wasn't about the sprinklers or the scandal or even the trial. It was about people remembering that their homes belonged to them, not to a board, not to a tyrant, not to someone with a clipboard and an agenda. Just them. And that was enough to make the whole lawn bloom again.